Good evening and happy Sunday, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Hope you're able to worship God this morning. And I guess I just am thinking about life and more importantly, discerning what is alive. Uh, for a lot of things, we're pretty good at that. Basically, things that exist on the scale of an individual creature, a single bodied organism. We're pretty good at discerning the difference between life and death. There's a couple edge cases every once in a while, but we know the difference between a living being and a corpse on the scale of of an individual. When we start to look at things that go in between individuals, things that join many people together, it can get a little bit harder to see if this thing is really alive or if it's manufactured. Now, alive isn't necessarily good, and manufactured isn't necessarily bad. Both things have their place. However, I think an event, an organization, a group that's alive is always going to be more powerful than something that is dead or something that's artificial, something that's put together. That might sound like it's a little bit complicated. So let's see if we can take some examples. And there's one principle I think that can help us discern these things very well. And that's what happens when you remove a part of this, whatever it is? Does it wound or kill the thing, or does the thing keep on going? So I'll give you an example of something that's artificial. Last weekend, the liturgy office at the Diocese of Fargo ran a parish musicians workshop. I think we've been running these things since 2017. We went from having 3 breakout sessions to having 2 breakout sessions, and that was actually a good change. It was, my idea, although I didn't have to talk a whole lot of people into it, because there was a general consensus that our afternoons were too compacted, that we were putting too much stuff into these sessions, and that if we just left a little more space in the afternoon, uh, people would, um, appreciate that, and I think they did. Just a little more space to relax, a little more space to make connections with each other, seemed to be well appreciated. We haven't looked at our feedback forms yet. Be a useful thing to do. See if anybody else thought that, but that certainly was my impression. A workshop like this is probably not going to rise to the level of something that's really alive, right? Something that's moving us more than we are moving it. So you take a piece out of it, it's really not going to suffer all that much. You can move it around. You can change it. That's the benefit of having something that's artificial. Something that's artificial can be modified by us. Something that's living, something that's bigger than us, that can't just be modified by us. Needs to um, that needs to keep its integrity intact. It's not something that we can just move around. You remove something from it, it's at least going to be damaged, but it may in fact be destroyed entirely. It's a little harder to come up with this, but I think that when it's you notice it, you notice it. When you start messing around with this living tradition, when you start messing around with this living thing, it gets wounded, it gets broken somehow. People accuse it of whoever's messing with it of ruining it. So that's a thing to consider. I was pondering this as I was pondering the liturgy, as I often do. I think a very good liturgy would be something that we can't just modify all on our own. So that's what I'm thinking about. If you want to come on in, we've got the StreamYard link posted, and we've got Kirk here. Hello, Kirk.
Hey, have I met you before, Father Eric?
I don't believe so.
So,
Welcome aboard.
I know you from. Does my camera have to stay on?
Why don't you give me 2 or 3 minutes, huh?
Okay, the reason is because even though I don't particularly care, I'm not the most handsome fellow, and kept next to you, I don't want to be embarrassed. But
Well,
um,
don't worry about that. Yeah, what's up?
uh, not much. I mean, so the way I know you is through Jacob's stream.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
very active. Well, I used to be very active in TLC. I got in there from the Noahide stuff. Then
Hmm.
for a little, so basically, here's just my story. I went to TLC. I got banned for a little bit. I went back and I got unbanned from TLC. Then I was inactive for a couple months, and then I came back for a couple months, and then I've also gone off for a couple months recently, and I've just come back yesterday. So I'm not that consistent about my participation in it, but I like TLC, and I know you, and I know Father Stephen from it.
Okay. Okay. Well, interesting. Well, you've now convinced me that you're not going to porn bomb the stream. So if you wanted to turn the camera off, I think I'll give you that permission. If somebody's going to do that kind of nonsense, I'll make them show their face to the world first. But you appear to be behaving yourself.
I mean, TLC is actually more Christian than it is Jewish.
You think? Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's also just more Christians in the world than Jews, so
I
that's
know, but it's a
statistical
specific. I
probability.
mean, the main founders, you could say, of TLC are Jacob and Hezi. So, I mean, you also have to understand it's net going to be a disproportionately Jewish and Noahide community, but even with that granted, more Christians participate in it.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's a well, Jacob seems to let just about anybody on his server, as long as they can behave themselves. Basically, a lot of wild characters there. And Josh, I haven't seen you in forever.
Hey, how's it going, Father?
Oh gosh, I had a busy weekend. I was filling in for a buddy of mine who's on a pilgrimage, and he had four masses the weekend. And it's just
Oh,
like, oh gosh, I
wow.
don't celebrate. Yeah, so now that I'm with the bishop, I usually don't celebrate four of my own masses anywhere. It was two Saturday night and two on Sunday. Um, so
Who-
yeah.
Who's have I met you before, Josh?
I don't believe so.
Are you participating in TLC in Jacob's corner of TLC?
I've poked my head in a couple times on a couple of his streams, but I kind of just float in and out of, you know, various, or basically just fathers through. Honestly, I'm Catholic, and so I tend to stick around this area.
So, Father Eric, what parish are you a father of?
So I'm actually not in a parish assignment right now. I was in the first 3 years of my priesthood, but the bishop asked me to be his secretary and director of liturgy for my diocese. So now instead of being in a parish, I drive him around, help him put on big liturgies, and do an administrative role with the diocese.
What's a diocese?
It's a territorial arrangement of the Catholic Church.
So it's higher level than a parish?
Yep, there'd be parishes inside of a diocese.
And which
And every
diocese are
diocese,
you part of?
Fargo, North Dakota.
I mean, North Dakota, that doesn't sound like a particularly Catholic area.
No, but it depends. It really depends on who settled the town that you're living in.
Yeah.
So you can go up to like Mountain, North Dakota, and Mountain was settled by people from Iceland. So there's never a Catholic church in Mountain. But then you go to like Napoleon, North Dakota, and that was settled by a bunch of Germans from Russia, which is a fascinating story in itself. And everybody's Catholic there. But I would say the Norwegian Lutherans and the German Lutherans probably were the majority of the people who settled here.
Well, to my understanding of the Protestant denominations, Lutheranism is probably one of the closest to the Catholic Church.
Depends on what flavor of Lutheran you're getting. I'd say certain flavors of Anglicanism might be closer.
Well, Anglicanism is a bit too liberal for most Catholics.
Yeah, well, it depends on what Anglicans you're talking about. That's the thing about Anglicanism is it's It's almost more of like an ethnic and historical category than it is a theological one. And so their goal has always been to have as big a tent for England as they could manage, um, and tried to keep a lot of different theologians in there. So while, like, you can go back to the 19th century, you'd have some Anglicans really embracing the higher criticism coming out of Germany at that time. We consider that very progressive. You'd also have guys like John Henry Newman and the Oxford movement who are uh, looking to Rome for a lot of things, and then an awful lot of those guys just ended up becoming Catholic, but they started off as Anglicans. So depends on where you're looking in the global Anglican family. Um,
And were you raised in the Catholic Church?
yep, yep, every Sunday.
I see. Yeah, I mean, so did you grow up in North Dakota?
No, my dad was in the Air Force for 23 years, so we got to move around a fair bit. It wasn't until I was in high school that we moved to North Dakota.
I see. And yeah, I mean, it sounds like a pretty nice place. I mean, the weather's pretty nice and things are a lot cheaper, even though there's not as much not as many people.
There's not near as many people. Are you also in California?
I'm not in California, so I grew up in New Orleans, but my family moved to Mississippi. We're in Picayune, which is the southeast of Mississippi, but we're pretty close to New Orleans.
Okay, you don't sound like Mississippi to me, so my
Yeah.
apologies.
That's because I mean, you acquire an accent when you're younger, not when you're.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's fun. That's fun.
And
Yeah,
did you
yeah.
always want to be a member of the or like a what's it called,
Priest.
clergy member?
For the first 3 years of seminary, God had to talk me into it. I he had to wrestle me down. He had to pin me after all that. But as it turns out, he's can be very persuasive. So yeah, I guess always it was always kind of on the radar. It was always an option for me, but took a while for me to settle into the idea of it. And now that I'm doing it, I don't know what else I'd be doing. So
I mean, is there something if you weren't a priest or if you weren't a clergy member, what would you do?
that's the question, right? Like, I really don't know. I would I be a teacher, or police officer, something with computers, some kind of engineering? Like,
I
I
mean,
don't know.
are you more interested in like teaching or physical stuff or like interacting with people? Like
I
there, it
I
depends on your personality type.
I think I'm interested in Catholic stuff.
I
Fair
think
I
he's
enough.
might
kind
be a
of
little
sold
more.
out there. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think you're kind of, checked off as far as careers now, as far as that goes, right?
yeah, yeah. I'd probably have a bias more towards things than people, just temperamentally. But you could still make that work as a priest. That's why I pilot a desk now.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually, so my dad's Roman Catholic, but my mom's Greek Orthodox, and so I'm pretty sure I'm technically speaking ethnically Catholic, but I was baptized in the Orthodox Church, so I don't know.
Well, as far as I'm also studying canon law. So as far as the Code of Canon Law is concerned, you're not Catholic. So
Okay.
nothing personal. Just you have to be baptized into the Catholic Church or received into it in order to. There's no ethnic Christianity.
Hey, Father, actually, I have a question. Kurt, do you mind if I ask a Father a quick question about that?
Yeah.
So, in the in like first century in that, or I guess right after the Roman Church was established, so like third century, middle third century, would a Eastern Orthodox go to a like Roman Catholic mass, or would that not have happened?
Like third century?
Yeah,
No, they would have been unified in those days.
yeah,
It
that's
wouldn't
what
have
I
been.
meant.
Yeah, yeah. There was a few schisms that got patched up through the centuries between East and West. But the big one that lasted between Constantinople and Rome wasn't until 1054.
Right. So up until that point, like it would have been common for somebody from Constantinople, if you were visiting Rome, to attend the mass, right?
I suppose so. I'm not. I mean, that's a lot of. There's a lot of details there that I don't have access to. Like,
Oh,
how would
okay.
you know where mass is? Right? They didn't have masstimes.org.
Well, yeah,
You
no,
know,
I don't know how it was celebrated in the early days. I had been curious about that, if there was ever a time when mass, like might have attended both, or it would have been common to attend both if they both were present in your city or something.
yeah. I mean, like both, like an Eastern style liturgy and a Western style liturgy.
Yeah, like would it have ever been common for like somebody who had family in both, like Kirk here, to attend both?
I suppose so, but that's a lot of mobility for the ancient world right there. So I don't
Yeah,
think.
well, I was curious because like in our small town, we like in Southwest Colorado, there was a very small group of Eastern Orthodox, and they used the sanctuary at the Catholic Church here, and they had talked to the father about it and everything. Were given permission. I don't know if that's kosher or whatever, but
Yeah,
if he was supposed to do that or not. But I know it took place at one point in time.
yeah. I think you can actually get permission for the Orthodox specifically because, as far as we're concerned, they celebrate the same Eucharist that we do. So them using our altar is it can be okay, as long as
Yeah,
everybody's properly consulted, and you get the right people's permissions. I need to reference the ecumenical directory to see whose permission exactly you need for that. But
gotcha. Sorry, I didn't mean to distract from the conversation, Kurt. I had been
It's
wondering
okay.
about that. And I just saw an opening for my question there. Sorry.
yeah,
Well, for
well,
what
I
I
mean,
Oh no, it's my turn now.
okay,
It's my
Oh,
turn.
as long as it's a serious question, Andrew.
Yeah, Only serious questions from me.
Yeah,
Uh, so are you a canon lawyer yet, or
I'm in school. I'm about halfway there.
okay? All right, good luck with it.
he's gonna be what's the Catholic equivalent of Saul Goodman? Pope Goodman? I don't know.
Cardinal Guido Sarducci. That's what you need to. Josh might know that reference. He was a
yeah,
Saturday
yeah,
Night Live character, right?
yeah. My dad was always going on about that. He
I mean,
liked that
canon
skit.
law.
Mhm.
The only thing more complicated than canon law in terms of religious law would probably be halacha, because I think is it more complicated than Sharia?
And man, don't
I
look at
mean,
me. So, like,
that,
related to that question, like, how does canon law develop, or how is it developed through history? Like,
Yeah. So in the early centuries, everything was custom. They didn't have law yet. And it's really interesting. You get to first accepted ecumenical council, Nicaea. They came out with canons rather than nomos, right? So they had a word for law in Greek, perfectly good law, nomos, and they chose not to do that. They said, "Oh, we're just going to have a measuring rod. We're just going to have canons, right?" And so this is what you got to measure up to. That's what the word canon in Greek means. Um, and so custom, like the way people were actually operating things, that was kind of the way people approached the governance in the church. And then looking back to the tradition of the apostles, for like the first millennia of Christianity, the study of canon law as a science didn't really begin until like the 11th century at the University of Bologna, right? And it kind of developed alongside scholasticism. And a lot of it had to do with concerns about papal, decretals and legislation. So they didn't really think about it as a legal system, even though it was
the
functioning like a legal
criddles.
system. Um, that would be um, a
Is that a term
decretal.
in canon law?
Yeah, it is a term. It is a term. That would be kind of a rule given by the Roman pontiff or a local bishop. to here's how we're going to do things.
Hmm.
They were very often private replies, so they weren't promulgated out to the world. But some of these private replies, over time, kind of customarily took on a normative force. You know, when people looked at that and said, "Well, that's actually the way we should be doing things."
Is that like a standard operating procedure? Like just kind of like a way we do this or that?
Yeah, yeah. But some of it came out of just custom, and some of it just came out of, well, the Pope said this to these people, and we think that makes a lot of sense, so that's the way we're going to do it. But there was kind of this, explosion in canon law and the interest in canon law, and um, how do we actually work these things? Part of it was the rediscovery of Justinian's code in the West in those centuries. And then they started reading the legal commentaries that the Greeks and the Romans came up with, and began applying that to governance in the church. And so that's when the science of canon law, as an ordered discipline, really began to exist. And you could actually get people who were like qualified canon lawyers, rather than folks who were just trying to figure things out and doing the best they could.
Well, did the development of canon law at all coincide with the development of like hermeneutics? Like when Schleiermacher and Dilthey and those people were starting to use hermeneutics to interpret the Bible, did canon law in the Catholic Church also start to use hermeneutic methods developed by them?
Oh gosh, I don't think canon law operates like that. It's pretty firmly grounded in the tradition, right? So um
I've wondered about that as well. If hermeneutic was, I was just saying, I've wondered about that as well. If hermeneutic was ever used, if any, 'cause, like I was raised Protestant, so my dad, had his nice big thick copy of Wayne Grudem's systematic theology that we used to go off of, and yeah, he was always going on about hermeneutic, and I was wondering if that had ever been used by the church at all. I was curious too.
yeah, well, you're going to have a hermeneutic whether you like it or not. And the canon lawyers, we've got our handy dandy code of canon law here. At the bottom of every one of the canons, we've got the fontes, right? I don't expect you to be able to read that, but we got the fontes there. And that tells you where the canon comes from. Sometimes it's from more recent legislation or the Second Vatican Council, but other times it's from the 1917 Code of Canon Law. And the 1917 Code of Canon Law had a very uh, it's like a 6-volume set of everything that it drew on, in addition to the standard works from the late Middle Ages.
And how much of it comes
So
from the Bible?
a little bit of it, but it's mostly concerned of how. So it's interwoven with theology. It's definitely interwoven with theology. We could look at something like the Pauline privilege in annulment proceedings, and we can link that right back into the writings of St. Paul, which is why we call it the Pauline privilege. Um, so some of it is like directly based on scripture, and some of it's based on the developed teaching of the church, um, and you can use theological principles. If I was judging a case, I could quote the catechism, I could quote the Bible, and use those to make legal cases in whatever judgment I'm writing. So that's your hermeneutic right there. Is the tradition of the church, and both its canonical and theological traditions. So if you read sentences from the Roman Rota, that's an appellate court in Rome. They usually end up mostly handling marriage cases. They'll be referencing Thomas Aquinas. They'll be referencing the Catechism of the Catholic Church. All those things as a part of their arguments. So it's not fully positive law, even though some of it is positive law.
Well, who's your favorite
So
of the church fathers, like Augustine, Aquinas, etc.?
Aquinas isn't technically a church father. We cut that off in about the 7th century. But Aquinas is one of my favorites. I do like reading some Augustine, a little bit of Ambrose. His Sacrament of Theology is good. Uh, Jerome's useful with the Bible. I like them all, though. Well, actually, I don't like them all. Some of them are kind of lame, like the B Squad ones. All
My
the
mean,
big
turn, my
names are
turn,
good.
my turn, my turn, my turn, my turn. All right.
You have a
So,
favorite church father, Andrew?
oh no, I've got well,
he's
I've got no
Orthodox.
clue. I've got no clue about the church fathers. Um,
Okay.
so like, if you're writing the next edition of the Code of Canon Law, like, how do you do that? How do you use this edition? Like, why would you write a new edition? Like,
So the 17 code is a real interesting, I mean, it's a magnificent piece of work. There had been no codified universal law in the church before 1917, right? And they basically had one guy put the whole thing together.
yeah.
Absolute staggering genius and probably extremely boring, Cardinal Gaspari, who would just do nothing but canon law all day. And he was perfectly happy living like that. The church produces monsters like that every once in a while. And a lot of what he brought into the 1917 Code of Canon Law was the way the Roman Curia was functioning. And I'm not the only person to say this. You can hear all sorts of people say this. It was dealing with the aftermath of Vatican I, which was an unfinished council. They didn't do everything they had intended to. So they had a really good document about faith, right? What is that? Oh, I can't remember the name of it, but it's excellent. It responds to rationalism and all sorts of other things that we don't need to worry about right now. And then they had a document on the Roman Pontiff. They were intending to write a document on bishops, a document on priests, on religious, really start to fix a whole bunch of things up, but they never finished it. And so there was kind of this lopsided Roman emphasis in the 1917 Code of Canon Law. Things were a little too centralized. So something that bishops had to do every 5 years was write Rome and ask for faculties to do their job, which is it's like, okay, is this guy a bishop or not? They need to write, and um, so that's that. There's this kind of this overly centralized Roman emphasis on things. You get to 1958. I think it was January 25th, 1958. St. John the 23rd announces the Second Vatican Council, and he announces a revision of the Code of Canon Law. So in his mind, those two things have come together. And the Code Commission that was going to revise it knew they needed to wait until the end of the Second Vatican Council before they could implement those changes. So they, 1965 to 1983, they worked on incorporating the theology of Vatican II into the Code of Canon Law. And I'm here to tell you that nobody implemented Vatican II better than the canon lawyers. We're the best. We're the best at implementing Vatican II. We understand things the best. So that was kind of the impetus. Like, we didn't want, when Pope St. Pius X, started working on the Code of Canon Law, he didn't want a new one every 20 years or so. Like, he wanted a code that, okay, maybe we'll adjust this sometime, but like, it needs to be a real stable body of laws, so we don't have to deal with the confusion of, does this law still apply? Because that was like, I can't even imagine doing canon law prior to 1917, because it's like, okay, how far back do we go? And like, is this still a binding law on us? It must have just been an absolute mess to deal with. Whereas now it is codified, at least it's slightly less of a mess.
Let's go.
And so what you deal with mostly marriage law. So what are the major aspects of Catholic canon law that I mean, in your experience, are more complicated to deal with or require more specialization?
Uh, like Catholic law in general.
Catholic law in general, but even just the one you work in. Like, what do you find tends to be a little bit harder to pierce?
Yeah, so the marriage cases are really tricky, partially because doing them the way we're doing them is very new. Um, we you like There was a sudden spike in demand for annulments starting sometime in the 1950s and then hitting a real crescendo in the 1970s. because there was a massive increase in divorce, and we're trying to figure out how to manage all of that. And the church is trying to respond, and like had to develop a whole bunch of, okay, like we've got all this theology about like what makes marriage. How do we try and apply it juridically to these particular cases before us, investigate validity and nullity right there? And so they're always very difficult cases to judge, especially if it's a full formal case, because you're dealing with people's motivations, you're dealing with people's memories, you're trying to figure out what happened, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. So just the quality of the investigation is just a rather difficult thing.
I mean, do you at all work in Catholic philosophy, or are you well versed in Catholic philosophy and theology beyond just canon law?
Yeah. So I did the 8 years of seminary. I did um, all the school that all of us priests were supposed to do. So, I mean, I'm not going to claim any expertise, but it's I have the general training that all the priests get.
And in general, would you say that the Catholic philosophical tradition is more influenced by continental philosophy or analytic philosophy?
Forget both of those. That's too new. We're not worried about that. Plato and Aristotle, baby.
I get, yeah, that's true. I mean, but in the modern day, so do you know who a man by the name of Jean-Luc Marion is?
No.
Okay, because I'm interested in mostly continental philosophy, and he's a French Catholic philosopher who's wait, for some reason it was breaking up. Is it better now?
You're better. You're better.
Okay. He was a French Catholic philosopher who works in phenomenology, and I mean, in general, it seems like a lot of the modern philosophers who are baptized Catholic, like Heidegger, etc., are continental, not
Yeah,
analytic.
sure. I mean, it's a big tent, right? It's a really big tent. You got all sorts of people doing all sorts of things out there, and I can't really keep track of all of it. What I do know is there are three people mentioned by name in the Code of Canon Law. That is Jesus, his mother, and Thomas Aquinas. And the context that Thomas Aquinas is mentioned in is in the education of seminarians. So while as a theologian and as a believer, you can adopt the philosophical systems and the theological systems of all sorts of different thinkers and remain within the bounds of acceptable thought, the church asks that its priests get trained with Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah. I mean, are there any I guess you could say more contemporary thinkers who you're sympathetic to or who you're partially influenced by? Not Catholic thinkers, but just philosophers in general.
Yeah, I mean, it would be. I don't think this live stream would exist if Dr. Peterson hadn't, been unable to sleep at one night. So I found a lot of his work to be pretty interesting. I say actually, probably in my day-to-day life, the Big Five, like his exposition on the Big Five personality inventory, is just really useful, right? Because I could just be like, okay, this is a very agreeable person. They're going to be
Josh, can
different
you?
from me. Yeah.
My turn.
So
Yeah.
Super random question. So like what's the Roman collar like signify? Is there any meaning to it or
yeah, the Roman collar is actually pretty new. So black is real simple, right? This is the cheapest dye, right? So black is the color of the poor. So yeah, like imagine it's not current day. Imagine it's 1,000 years ago. You've got a bunch of leftover dyes. You mix them all together, you get black dye, and that's what you sell for cheap. So the black kind of signifies, death to the world and voluntary embrace of poverty. Although I don't take a vow of poverty as a diocesan priest, I'm allowed to own property. The white collar, I haven't heard a good explanation for the white collar yet. It's like this kind of circular design is kind of modern. So I don't have a great answer for you right now, but it looks good. So I'm not gonna question it too much.
Mhm.
I mean, it's pretty dope. I mean, for a technically colorless thing, black and white's pretty nice.
It
Um,
works.
has it always been the case that Catholics wore that, or was there ever a time when church officials wore red, or like
Well,
not the Pope, but the average priest?
yeah, I think black is a pretty old tradition. I mean, Andrew, over at your wacky Coptic church, do the priests wear black robes too?
Yeah, it's all black. Mhm.
Yeah, so I think the black is a common Christian tradition, um, with different cuts, different cuts of fabric. This is an Italian cassock, so it's gonna have that Italian touch into it. Um, but yeah, we have color coding with different bishops and cardinals and all of that in the West. So if you can read the language, you can figure out, okay, this guy's at least a Monsignor, this guy's a bishop, this guy's a cardinal. There's some of that color coding going on there.
Mhm. What's a cardinal?
Cardinal is a clergy of Rome with two duties: one to advise the Pope, and two to elect the next Pope.
I
It's a good way. It's a real solid way of electing the Pope. I like it. It's been working for centuries now. We haven't had a heavily disputed election in like 500 years, so that's
Yeah, that's good.
awesome.
So, like, how do you become a cardinal, and who usually becomes a cardinal?
You get asked by the Pope to become a cardinal.
Really?
Yeah, so it's all kind of the machinery runs itself. This
Mhm.
isn't a democracy, even if it is an election.
Hey, Father, you are those. We were talking about philosophy just a second ago. What were your thoughts, or did you ever get into Marcus Aurelius and meditations, or what were your thoughts on Stoicism?
Yeah, I mean, we did like the historical drive-by of Stoicism, and I don't think I've read much Stoic literature, because I think a lot of what was useful in Stoicism got picked up by the church's moral tradition,
I
and
agree.
and just kind of taught to us in seminary.
Yep.
So whereas a lot of people like pick up Stoicism and it really helps them out because they were going down, and it kind of stopped them from going down, and gave them maybe an opportunity to start looking up instead. So I haven't dived
Yeah.
deeply into it, but I recall Archbishop Vigneron. I went to seminary in Detroit. He's the Archbishop of Detroit, and he was talking about if he was living in the pagan world before Christ, he thought the best option would be Stoicism.
Yep. I
And
completely. Yeah.
he there we are in the cathedral in Detroit. I know he knows he's got a bunch of seminarians there. He's got every. He says that. Wonder how many people really understood it. But I remember him saying that. Like, it kind of makes sense. But it is a bit pessimistic. There's
Yeah.
no. It's not. It's not a story that gets any bigger than you.
No. And I find a lot of times like I work in a manual labor job, and so I'm working around a lot of blue collar, not really any college or anything like that. And I find stoicism is being practiced a lot by, like, if you get to any good working company, like say a plumbing company or like a construction company, there'll often be a foreman or a lead guy. And I don't know, I've often found that, like, yeah, like, like what Marcus is talking about, and that, like, personified in people, just in, like, and you always find them, like I said, like, my brother was working a job for Oprah Winfrey up here in Telluride, Colorado. And it was a really big project, and the plumbing on it was absolutely crazy. But there was this one old plumber who'd been plumbing forever. He was so advanced, like he could actually like design systems and stuff like that. And this was like so custom and high end. Anyways, it was just the way my brother talked about him was like yeah, it's just like this guy would take on like anything and like never complained about his job and like, had his little jokes about hoop flowing downhill and don't always wash your hands and paychecks on Friday, and stuff like that. But he just, he suffered in his job well, and he was an inspiration to the guys that worked around him. And anyways, it was just like you read about Stoicism, but you can also find it personified in the world and that. And I find it a lot in working class industries.
Yeah, I mean, a philosopher that is actually making stuff up and innovating is a bad philosopher. Right?
Yeah,
Good
there you go.
philosophers are studying what's already there,
Mhm.
and they're just articulating it in a way that can be written down and communicated. Like that's so yeah. Obviously, insofar as Marcus Aurelius is giving good advice, he's describing hopefully things that he's doing, or at the very least, observing other people do,
Yeah,
and that might be
I think
good enough.
a lot of philosophy is like that. Like it's observations. You sound so wise in that, but it's really just observations, and then your own personal life. You have a great difficulty following some things you see, the discipline habits you see in other people. Like we can all quote Jocko Willink, but very few of us are willing to get up at 4:30 in the morning and start doing push-ups. you know.
Well, I mean, to be fair, he says he needs less sleep than average.
Yeah, but he's
I don't.
obviously setting the standard. So
Yeah.
it's like you know what I mean? It's like you can only follow these guys so long without being like, yeah, okay, maybe that's the next step. It's like, maybe I get up a little earlier or whatever.
I tell you what, it is useful to wake up early. Nobody wants you
Hey,
that early.
wake up before your problems. Wake up before your problems. And, this is
You
like
start
you
putting
just
that
said.
in. You just start putting that into practice, Andrew. I'm sure the
Yeah.
Wake up
environment that
earlier.
you're in. Yeah, I'm sure the environment that you're in is conducive to that. I'm
Maybe.
joking. I'm saying the exact opposite of the truth right now. I don't know.
That's funny.
I think our colleges would improve a fair bit if we forced everybody to get to morning prayer at 7 a.m. like I was when I was
I
in
think
seminary.
so. There's a
Just go
lot
to
of Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom to that. Just waking up early and how much that changes your world.
yeah. Speaking of waking up early, Jim here. You've woken up so early. It's tomorrow, right?
Yeah, in Sydney, it's exactly 12 minutes past 12 in the afternoon, Monday, the 28th of
That's
October.
waking up early right there. I don't think any of you guys can wake up early enough for it to be tomorrow.
Right, we're ahead, I think. Yes, how are you all, boys? Father?
Doing all right. Doing all right. Had a busy weekend, but it's what I signed up for, so I really shouldn't complain about it.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I'm
I mean,
a Catholic also, so
Yeah.
have I met you before, Jim?
yes, I think you did.
Well, are you active in Jacob's corner in TLC?
No, I'm not. I don't think I am.
Okay, yeah, then I probably haven't met you because I mostly just hang. Well, I hang out in Jacob and Hezzy's corner, but I don't really hang out much outside of there.
All
No
right.
offense to Catholics, just not my religion.
That's all right. You can't help bad luck, I suppose.
I suppose. So, Father Eric, I'm curious. Do you have do you know who Gerard is?
Rene Girard.
Yeah.
I'm mildly familiar with him, but I haven't done a deep study.
Well, I brought him up because I heard somebody say a lot of philosophy is observing the practices or behaviors of other people and kind of creating. That's sounds sort of similar to what Gerard talked about with the mimetic theory. Because from what I know about Gerard's philosophy is that people copy other people basically this leads to desire, violence. So, I mean, it's a whole thing
You see,
anthropologically.
that's like I said, usually Mark's on. I think he's traveling this weekend. My friend, my fellow man who has God as his barber, Mark Lefebvre, and he pointed out something to me about Gerard that I think's really useful to notice. Is Gerard only gives one option for that mimetic desire, and that's competition. But mimetic desire can actually do all sorts of things, right? So, like, you might look at Jocko Willink and say, "Oh, I want what he has," but instead of like trying to kill him and take his wife, you actually just start putting the principles he espouses into practice. And then, okay, you won't have his wife specifically, but maybe you'll get a girlfriend if you do that, by becoming a useful citizen of the world. So that's an interesting thing to note about him is, his account of mimetic rivalry is something that certainly happens, right? And I'm not going to sit there and pretend that it doesn't happen, but it's not guaranteed to be the only way that those things go. It kind of assumes that it's always going to end up being a zero-sum game, and you won't be able to share whatever good it is that this other person wants.
Yeah. I mean, Gerard's an interesting character. It's odd that I haven't heard him mentioned by Peterson, because Peterson does talk about archetypes, but he also has said that memes are very similar to archetypes. When he was talking to Dawkins, and memes really don't come with Dawkins. Actually, I mean, mostly originate in the modern world with Gerard. So it's interesting.
Yeah. Well,
How'd you get into the gym, Father Eric?
Hmm?
How'd you get into the gym?
How did I get into the gym? Through the
Yeah.
door. What do you mean?
Who introduced you? Why did you
Oh,
walk in
well,
the
that was
first
football in
place?
high school. That was
Really?
football in high school. Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
it's like, you're going to play football, you got to go lift. And, I really wasn't very good at football, but I was good at lifting. So I'm
Perfect.
keeping up with that
Yeah.
because, it doesn't matter that I'm clumsy when you're doing squats, because your balance doesn't need to be that good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's even simpler when you're doing the bench press, because you don't need to balance anything except the bar.
Oh, yeah.
Even though I don't personally, I'm not currently very active in sports. I never played football, or I may have once, but I was never into football. But I did play soccer growing up, and I was part of a swim team for a little bit. But I mean, just football's always been a bit too rough for me.
Yeah, it might have been, part of it. I was like timid, right? And that's not a good quality for a football player. I wonder, like, as on the whole, I'm just less nervous now than I was in high school, and I'm wondering if I could go back. Like, would I be better? Would I be a little more aggressive? Would I be less timid? I have no idea. It could all just come rushing right back. So can't say one way or the other.
Can I ask a question of Father Eric? If I
Sure.
can? I'm one of those people who's unfortunate. I don't know whether I should say it. Sort of disappointed with Novus Ordo since Vatican II, 1965. I'm just sort of wondering, the magisterium of the Catholic Church, the rich history, etc., for the last 2,000 years has been by John the 23rd, who instigated Vatican II from 62 to 65, has deserted. For example, one of the biggest tragedies, which I think, again, subjective, it's my thought, but doesn't mean I'm right, is negating Latin, the church language. I mean, it's so rich. You can go to Mass pre-Vatican II anywhere in the world, from Asia, Africa, Australia, South America, you name it, even Mass, and you will understand the Mass. And unfortunately, I mean, I tend to go to here in Sydney to there's 3 or 4 churches who obey the traditional Latin, but unfortunately, Pope, to my, again, it's so easy to criticize and and say, oh, I'm right, I'm this and that. Anybody can do that, but if I can put it in a Socratic constructive criticism of our Pope Francis, hope I'm not castigated for saying so. I know his background is liberation theology, being Italian. That's his bad luck, I suppose. South America and all that, and his formation is probably very radical, especially the intellectual Jesuits. Leaving that aside, I really feel that I hope I'm wrong. I don't know your feeling. We are facing the third schism, one being 1054 with the Constantinople East and West, then with the Protestantism, Martin Luther in 1546, I think. And there's an undercurrent which I feel within our beloved Catholic Church, and I'm one of those fathers. I've got 4 children all grown up, and I'm a grandfather. But sort of, I'm one of those rare breeds, an old boomer, a grandfather, looking back, which this younger generation have not experienced. And in a way, I'm really sad about my beloved Catholic Church. Again, it's my personal opinion, doesn't mean I'm right. But I don't know. What's your thoughts on
Would
that?
you believe that in my canon law studies right now, I'm currently doing research for a paper which is studying the implementation of the parts of Vatican II where they start talking about doing the liturgy in the vernacular. And I've got this book here, Documents on the Liturgy, 1963 to 1979, and I've got like the whole list of languages in the liturgy here, and it was always intended by the both the fathers at the council who voted on it, and by the curial officials that only certain parts of the Roman liturgy would start to be moved into the vernacular. For the most part, those parts of the proper of the mass that would change, week to week, day to day, and there was this understanding that most of the ordinary would be retained in Latin. And part of the reason why I'm writing this paper is I'm trying to figure out when we lost the plot on that. Right? Because it's like I've got stuff from like 1968, and it's like consistent with what they were writing in 1963. It's like, yeah, you could start translating, the collect and the readings into the vernacular, but you're still going to have the ordinary of the mass be recited in Latin. Certainly the canon. And then, like, I'm just trying to figure out, like, at what point did that just like happen? Because, I've got gotta go grab another book here.
Andrew, please, for the love of God, you and Mike's breaking up.
So this right here is Roman Missal. It's American edition, so it's got the American proper calendar in here. This would have been properly updated with the new translation in 2011. And as far as I can tell, this Roman Missal, which a lot of people would say that it's the Mass of Vatican II, is actually not suitable and does not fulfill the requirements of Vatican II because it has like exactly 1 page of Latin in it. And I can take you right there. Like, okay, here we've got the Our Father, here we got the Our Father. Oh, look at there, it's in the vernacular. But maybe if you just want to be a little bit retrograde, we've also got the Pater Noster there in Latin. So I'm going to try and figure out when we lost the plot on that. But like through most of the 60s, it was no. We're going to keep on doing this. There's even you read the Sacrosanctum Concilium, like they were very insistent that clerics would continue to pray the Liturgy of the Hours in Latin, and that the only exceptions to praying the Liturgy of the Hours in Latin would be, okay, you've got the participation of a lot of people in the church, and we want to do it in vernacular so they can participate. And if you've got clerics for whom this might be a difficulty, let's say they never had good education in Latin, maybe we'll let them, with the permission of their local superior, do it in the vernacular. But like a lot of the stuff that was in Vatican II, just and I didn't live through it, but there must have just been some kind of like big rebellion against it, and that's the only way I can put it together. Is there was
Do you prefer
big rebellion.
traditional Latin Mass?
I do, yeah, but most days of the week I celebrate. I celebrate this bad boy most days of the week. because
I don't. So I've been to a couple of Catholic services. I don't know if I've been to a traditional Latin mass. If I have, I don't remember because it was just when I was so young. I haven't been to a church in a while. But I mean, in general, I think amongst young Catholics, it's getting more popular. And just aesthetically speaking, if it's more traditional, there's that aspect. But there's just also the element of like there's just a certain beauty to it that can't quite be described in words.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
well, on that point, if I can sort of comment, I do go to normal Novus Ordo church, and as I said, Latin, and um, I say to myself, oh, look, I can't make it. It's further away, the Latin Mass. So if I can't make it every Sunday, this week I'll be entertained with, the guitar and the drums and kumbaya. And unfortunately, I don't take the sacrament, Blessed Sacrament, from not being demeaning to women. If you don't kneel, they give you the host. So unfortunately, that's me. Maybe call me traditionalist, call me backward. I don't mind, but that's how I feel. And looking at the synod of synodalities, which is happening as we speak in Rome.
The sin of
Anyway, I'm
what?
sort of
It's so a synod, right? A synod is a gathering of people to discuss things, and we've been doing this synod on synodality since what 2019, 2018,
about that. Yes,
and it finally concluded today or
What's a
yesterday for you, Keith.
synodality?
that's right.
Well, that's the question there, Kurt. So we've been spending, 6 years talking about this thing, and nobody has a decent definition for what synodality is supposed to be. So
Uh,
when I learn what the word means, I'll explain it to you. But until then, we're just gonna wait.
I
yeah,
understand. I mean, I think one of the things also about the don't Catholic women have to cover their hair in church?
That used to
used
be
to
almost
be.
universal, and then in the 1960s, it was like we're not going to do that anymore. But if you go to a lot of the traditional Latin Mass parishes, they've taken up the habit
Yeah.
again.
Well, it's
But no,
more
that's no
part.
longer it's no longer a law.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, traditional Latin mass, you see, you got the altar. The priest is facing the altar, and the back is to the people. So you got the whole focus. It's like a pyramid, a spear. The priest, and then the people, and everybody's facing and praying to someone above. But now the inward-looking modern since '65, it's amongst the people. In other words, I see the history, again, putting it in a nutshell as I see it, is being part of the people. And church has never been, in my view, part of the people. Church has always been the shepherd, the leader, always for the underdog, whether poor, whether politically, culturally depraved, whatever. In Russia, in China, in Africa, in Europe, it's always been for the underdog, the Catholic Church I'm talking about. But unfortunately, that's the problem as I see it. I mean, I'm sort of trying to synthesize my thoughts in a couple of sentences. I'm not trying to conduct a lecture.
I mean, there's a pretty common critique going around of the post-Vatican II reform of the liturgy is that it's all just an intellectuals game. That these intellectuals had their theories about what liturgy should look like, and they're basically just experimenting on us. Uh,
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily just an intellectual thing. There is an aesthetic. There's aesthetic value either way, but I don't think the aesthetic judgment. It's hard to
I'm
say.
talking about with the Reformed liturgies, right? Like you
Well,
look at the traditional Latin Mass, you know, they're trying to trace a thread all the way back to the Apostle Peter and the first Christians in Rome, and the way that they would have worshipped God on Sunday. And obviously, we're going to expect there's going to be development and some change and some shifting there. But there was never any committee that would have placed all these things together. This would have never gone out for consultation. There was a broad continuity of it for at least 1,000 years between Saint Gregory the Great and the Second Vatican Council. And and when Saint Gregory the Great was codifying the Roman liturgy, he didn't innovate a whole bunch of things. He took the traditions that were already there and placed them into order. Saint Gregory the Great would have been 6th or 7th century Pope. So yes, he is a church father. He's a church father from whom I've heard positive comments from Orthodox commentators, the ones who are willing to consider theologians from the West.
One of the interesting facts I think about Catholicism is postmodernism came from Catholic countries. I mean, postmodernism really gave birth in France, and that had a steep Catholic influence. I wonder if there's any theological reason for why it was backed up like that. I guess Jacques Derrida, he came from a Jewish background, but other than that, Foucault, Deleuze, Lacan, Lyotard, and almost all the other French postmodernists came from ex-Catholic background. So, I wonder if there's a theological reason why, it gave birth to a culture like that.
I think it all kind of goes back to the French Revolution and the misapprehension of the American experiment. It's a pity we don't have Mark here because he would have a whole bunch of answers on that. But basically, in France, they had to, if they were going to come in and do something new, they had to demolish the Catholic Church or co-opt it at least, because the Catholic Church was too enshrined in the social fabric of France for you to be able to do something new without taking that out first. It's really funny the way it's worked out in France because Catholicism and royalism have a partnership there, and I'm an American, so I don't particularly want a monarch, but I don't begrudge anybody else their monarchs, right? It's a way that you can run your country, so it's not kind of required there. But there's basically just this steady stream of rebellion in France for hundreds of years now, and the postmoderns are basically just the 1970s manifestation of that rebellious spirit and the eldest daughter of the church.
Well, we're talking about the French Revolution and rebellion against the status quo. We should not forget the rise of Marxism in the 18th, 19th century and Freemasonry, which are
that came in Russia, which is Orthodox.
The biggest factors, particularly Freemasonry, on continental Europe, of the demise of the Catholic Church in France.
But Marxism is a Russian. It didn't come from a Catholic. It came from Orthodox population.
Well, are we talking about?
I would beg to differ. He said it's Russian, Marxism Russian. I don't follow. I'm sorry. What do you mean Russian?
Postmodernism. I brought it up because postmodernism came from France, which is a Catholic country, but Marx was from Germany, which was Lutheran. He was Jewish, and it came to be prominent amongst Russian intellectuals from Orthodox backgrounds.
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
No. If you're talking about the 1917 October Revolution and the elite, Kamenev, Zhivkov, Trotsky, the Russian Jewish elite, 85 of the Politburo of Lenin were Russian Jews, not Russians or peasants.
Well, they were Jewish.
Can you please read Alexander Solzhenitsyn, 200 Years Together? That's all I'm going to say. And he's a 1970 Nobel laureate. And he's the only Nobel laureate in literature who has all of his books printed officially, except 200 Years Together by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You can get a PDF. Um, I'll show you. If I can show you, I can.
Sure. 200 Years Later by Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
No, the title is 200 Years Together by Alexander.
Together. Excuse me. Why don't you just drop the link in the chat?
I certainly will. Just hold on.
Yeah. Now, Kirk, here's what I'm real curious in.
This is mine.
Yeah. Oh, now we're getting shaken around. Okay. Getting a little noisy there. Why are you so interested in where these different intellectual movements are coming from?
Well, the reason is, I believe a lot of intellectual movements have to be understood in a genealogical approach. And so understanding the genealogy of postmodernism, why was it given birth to in such a Catholic country?
I'm not sure. So, I mean, you could do that. You could do this genealogy, but I'm less interested in genealogy and more interested in teleology, right? So what is this system of thought? What are these ideas actually aiming towards rather than where did they come from? I think that's a much more interesting question, and it gets you there a lot more quickly. All righty, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, 200 Years Together.
I've heard of him from Peterson, but I don't know much about the guys that he was.
Well, these are
the Gulag Archipelago's.
These are his other books.
He's got the whole collection. All right.
No. Well, I've got a. I'll show you.
Shaking around again. Yeah,
that's my Russian collection. This is all. This is the boring collection. But anyway.
So I'll tell you, Kirk. I'll tell you that. I think if you can figure out what a intellectual movement is pointing at and where it leads to, that's much more useful information than where it comes from. And as far as I can tell, I look at the postmodernisms, I look at a lot of the Enlightenment ideals, I look at the Marxists, and I look at, let's say, reductive materialism, and I just look at all of those movements, and I'm like, that isn't going to go anywhere good. Nothing good's going to come out of that, and so I don't have to worry about these debates about genealogy, because I could just see where practically it's going to head. And I was able to intuit this even as like a young seminarian beginning my philosophy studies, because the big struggle within me was kind of this inherited materialistic determinism, which nobody had ever taught me. I just like absorbed it from somewhere. And that was kind of the struggle of my early philosophical education, was that. But I was never tempted to actually believe it, because I knew that was going to lead to a nihilism that wasn't going to serve anybody. And there was something true about, the faith and the prayers and the liturgy that I was doing, even if I couldn't defend it. But then the defense came eventually, but after the practice. So that's a whole lot for me to say that I'm just not that interested where it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There is an importance of treasuring ideas. I think the genealogy report can be important because you can understand, well, what's the context in which an idea gets written, so you can judge ideas that preceded it as well. But you're right that what's more important is the outcome, is not just the origin.
Right, and it's also, if you're in a debate with somebody, if you're in a debate with a bad actor, right? Somebody who isn't actually after the truth, somebody who's after something else other than the truth while pretending to be after the truth. The debates on the origin of ideas and where they really come from are just going to be a distraction. They're just going to be something that they can get you all caught up in. And that'll keep you away from the really useful part, where you say, every time that Marxism's been tried on a wide scale, millions have died. So, like, this isn't going anywhere good. So it really doesn't matter, if Marx was influenced by this or that or the other thing, because his ideas don't go anywhere well. That's my thoughts. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah. Um, I mean, so in terms of contemporary Catholic thought, to my understanding, recently, and correct me if it's wrong, there's been a resurgence in Aquinas and sort of neo-Aristotelian Catholic thought.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, resurgence in Aquinas, that's certainly true. It's really interesting. You read the history of philosophy as a seminarian in the early 21st century, and you're all excited about Thomas Aquinas because he's being held up as this great exemplar of the faith, and then you go and try and read him, and you realize how dumb you are, and then you go and you read about the history of the universities in the Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas lives, he writes his great works, he dies, and then for like 300 years, only Dominicans read him. Right, the Dominican order that he belonged to, he was their theologian, but oh, well, the Franciscans have their theologians, and the Augustinian hermits have their
Order
theologians.
Franciscans.
So you were talking about diocese. You asked about diocese. That's a territorial arrangement of the Catholic Church. There's also certain groups within the church that have a mission that binds them together, and they organize around the mission. They're very often named after their founders. So the Franciscans are that it's more of like a family of groups that follow after Saint Francis and the rule that he laid down and the order that he founded. Saint Francis of Assisi, 13th century Italian saint, extremely influential. So the Dominicans were founded by Saint Dominic, although they all have proper names, right? Because the guys who founded it didn't name it after themselves; other people named it after them. So the Franciscans is the Orders of Friars Minor, which sounds really fancy in Latin or in English, but when you translate it into its original, Latin and Italian, it's the Order of the Little Brothers. So they emphasize poverty, they emphasize dependence on God for everything, and that sort of thing. And the Dominicans were the order of preachers. They were founded as a preaching order, most especially to fight the Albigensian heresy in France in the 13th century. And they were quite good at their jobs because I'm sure you've never met an Albigensian.
What the hell is that?
The Albigensians. Oh, man. The Albigensians were they were a schismatic group in France in the I think they started in the 11th century, and they got pretty well put down in the 13th century. It was a reaction partially against the corruption of the clergy, and but that's one thing, and Lord knows I have reactions against corrupt clergy, but a whole bunch of weird Gnostic heresies came rushing right back in once they started rebelling against the church authority. And so, they had doctrines like marriage is evil, and anybody who begets a child is trapping, a soul in unclean matter. And all of these weird forms of Gnosticism, which the church hadn't seen in hundreds of years in the West, all just came rushing back in there. So St. Dominic founded the order of preachers to first off, live an exemplary holy life, so they wouldn't have the accusation of the corrupt clergy to throw at them, and then secondly, to prove all these things wrong. And so, in the Dominican constitutions of the order of preachers, they have written into their rule every brother will spend a certain amount of time studying in the afternoon in order to better comprehend the truth and attend to his preaching duties more faithfully. So they've got the Dominicans kind of grew up along with the universities in Europe. So it's
And
a
would you
real
say it's
interesting
fair
thing.
to say the Franciscans were more fideist or more so if from what I understand, fideism is the idea it's largely associated with Kierkegaard, the idea of relying on faith, whereas the Dominicans are
Probably
more, you
not
would say,
faith.
rational.
Probably not faith so much. I mean, so Saint Francis wasn't against universities. He wasn't against theology. He wasn't against learning. His, emphasis, and these are all matters of emphases, all within the Catholic Church, was divine providence, right? Which is a little bit different than just faith as such. This idea that you know, he could give up his wealth, he could give up his inheritance, he could go basically put on a garbage bag and start preaching. And because he was following the Lord and doing all of this, he would be taken care of. And as it turns out, he mostly was. But even when he was offered food, he often preferred to fast, lived a pretty extreme lifestyle of fasting and vigils. So I don't know if I would call that fideistic. I
Okay.
that's not really even a proper category when you're talking about medieval theology. They didn't see a sharp like disjunction between faith and reason. Like they were necessarily incompatible. This was the age that brought us scholastic theology, which was kind of, reason and logic being put at the surface of faith.
I mean, but there's always been a tension within Christianity about how much you emphasize arguments for your belief as opposed to just having faith in the belief. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not saying there's no overlap. And
Mm.
Aquinas, who's arguably the most pro-reason Catholic theologian of the Middle Ages, did say there's room for faith, but I see a pretty stark contrast between Aquinas saying that it's better for somebody to not believe in Christ on reason than to accept it on faith, and Tertullian, for example. Tertullian.
Where does Aquinas say that?
Um,
It does,
I heard
believe.
this in a lecture once, but I can't pull it up right now. But
I'd be very interested
Mm.
to see that particular article there, because
Mm.
I mean, maybe memory is fuzzy, or maybe the person who was reporting this was fuzzy. It doesn't sound like Aquinas on faith at all. So we can we've talked about this on this channel before, but it's always worth going back to. Aquinas's definition of faith is the act of the intellect assenting to divinely revealed truths by the command of the will, as moved by grace.
here, I can't pull it up while I'm on StreamYard.
Mhm.
I'll look it up on stream. I'll look it up and then I'll come back on StreamYard. Is that okay?
Or you could just post it in Jacob's server, and we'll take a look at it tomorrow.
Okay, yeah, we'll look at it tomorrow. I just I
We don't have
couldn't.
to settle everything tonight. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I heard it in a lecture from, well, the guy who given it wasn't Catholic. He was an objectivist philosopher, and he was giving a lecture on the history of reason. And he said something to that effect was Aquinas' view, but I don't
Okay.
quite remember.
Yeah. I like to hear about philosophers from people who love them the best. And I'm not sure an objectivist would really have much love for Aquinas there. As the thing is that a lot of people who criticize Aquinas for becoming overly rationalistic, their criticisms really nail a lot of people who came after Aquinas, but not him so much. Like I'm a big Aquinas fanboy. We'll just lay all that out there. I think Aquinas is the best. Um, you can see kind of like a degradation in theology after Aquinas, where it starts becoming a little bit too logical, a little bit too rationalistic. So you get to the point where you're in like the 15th, 16th centuries. You try and read somebody like Francisco Suarez and his metaphysics, and it's just awful, right? Like these extremely attenuated distinctions and like piles upon piles of syllogisms and rational arguments. You barely read it. And reading Aquinas, sometimes he's a little difficult because he's dealing with difficult subject matter, but his use of logic and reason is really just very well done at the surface of truth. But yeah, the he didn't see. This is a useful thing to remember with a lot of the medievals, is that they had this ability to handle different levels of freedom better, right? So you get to the 16th century, 17th century, especially the era of the reformers, predestination becomes a huge theological topic, right? And just tomes and tomes, and you've got Calvinism versus Arminianism, right? And then this also had a manifestation in the Catholic Church where they started debating these sorts of things themselves because it was in the air and like people were. And so you've got the Thomists versus the Molinists, which the Thomists won, but never mind that. The same sort of arguments about predestination, prevenient grace, the freedom of God, the freedom of human beings in response to God, and the basic assumption that goes behind a lot of those 16th and 17th century arguments is that if God's freedom is expanded, there's no more room for humanity's freedom. Right? They're like a zero-sum game right there. And so if God has more of the pie, then human beings necessarily have less of the pie. And you go back to Aquinas, and he does like one brief question on predestination. It's like, yep, God is free and he calls those whom he wants, and human beings freely respond to them. And if they behave in a bad way, they are accountable for it and are punished for it. Let's move on to something more interesting. Because his vision of God wasn't such that if God's freedom was expanded, human freedom was contracted, right? They're actually compatible to each other. That God uses our freedom to accomplish his own ends because he's God and he can do that.
I mean, do you believe there's an easy resolution to the problem of how do we reconcile human free will with God's omniscience and omnipotence? Because if God's all
There's a,
powerful and all knowing,
there's a very easy solution.
St. Augustine is a good start.
Yeah, there's a very easy solution. Don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. Like,
don't worry about it.
yeah, just don't worry about it, right? Look, obviously, you have your internal experience of your freedom, your ability to choose. You know that it has limits, right? So, like, you can't just choose anything. You know, it's circumscribed within certain limits of infinity. And then you know that you're created in the image and likeness of God. So that freedom that you have can be understood of God, but our understanding of what God is up to is so tiny compared to the reality that our concepts and our digging into it are never going to line up well at all with the reality of what God's doing.
I understand.
Can I, on that
Yes.
point, can I simply add, like you said, don't worry about it. Apparently, St. Augustine was battling with that very question of free will, and apparently was walking on the shores of Mediterranean, Alexandria, today's Egypt, on the shores. He was deeply in thought about theology of God and the issue of human free will. How can he reconcile? And he came upon apparently a little child, a boy. He sort of dug a hole on the shore, and he says, "Oh, what are you doing, little boy? What are you trying to do?" He says, "I'm going to get that. I will manage." Or words to that effect. I haven't got the exact quote. Get all that ocean into that little hole before you will figure out the issue what you're thinking about, which is free will. And he disappeared. It was an angel. It was an apparition. But the point being, we are trying to, in a way, asking questions which are not answerable in our human limitations of sound, feelings.
I mean,
etc.
So, Father Eric, you were bringing up you don't think an objectivist would like Aquinas. The reason I brought it up was because from what so have you ever wrestled with objectivism?
Not particularly. I mean, but the big wrestling I had was with reductionist materialism. I don't know. I don't understand objectivism all that well. Is that a part of it or not? I
No.
can't remember.
So objectivism. So I mean, Ayn Rand basically developed it, and it's the context of the lecture was objectivist whole thing is we believe in pure reason. We don't accept faith as legitimate. We want to go by the evidence and logical argumentation based on evidence. And they were saying Aquinas is one of the objectivist favorite Catholic or Christian philosophers because even though they're very anti-Christianity, they still accept that Aquinas was carving out room for reason during a very non-reasonable age in the Middle Ages. And they were praising him for that, even though ultimately the criticism is he was trying to have his cake and eat it too by
Yeah,
packaging reason and faith.
yeah. They're misunderstanding the Middle Ages entirely if they think that was an age of unreason right there. Like that was the age that brought us universities, and you're going to call it an age of unreason?
Well, they would argue, but that's because of Aristotle, not because of the church.
Okay, yeah. And the church founded these universities so that they could
Yeah,
have
that's right.
reliable training for the clergy. It's
Scholasticism.
just there's a lot of this, or image of the Middle Ages comes to us from anti-Catholic propaganda
Hmm.
from English-speaking Protestants.
So it's
Like
absolutely.
that's just there's a
absolutely.
huge amount of that gets
Oh.
baked into us because of Henry VIII, who was evil.
Hmm.
And it,
Yeah,
But-
so I just that's
Adulterer
why
like how King Charles III in Australia.
who's King Charles III?
King Charles III is the current King of England or Great Britain, and he's married to that divorcee woman that left her husband, and he left his wife, Diana, and now he's King of England. Oh,
Very
Great
not Catholic.
Britain. But it's common knowledge if you don't know. I mean,
yeah.
I
Is it-
don't. I just don't pay attention much to monarchs across the world. But yeah, I'm very
You have
American.
to understand, Jim, that he's not our monarch.
exactly.
Sure, is he
no,
still,
he's
is he
not.
still,
No.
yeah.
No, he's not my monarch. Of course, he's not. I mean,
Well, isn't he still on you guys' money down there?
no, he was here for a couple of minutes, and he went to one of these. I think he's in Samoa at the moment. I think
Okay.
Commonwealth meeting of states or whatever, and then they castigated him. They all said reparations now for slavery. So someone's got to be paying a lot of
I've heard of
millions of
King
dollars.
Charles. Is he super woke or?
He's got a bit of a perennialist streak, I've heard.
He's a pantheist. I think that's what he believes.
A
Well,
perennial.
Perennialism, that's the view that all religions are trying to come at the same thing.
Yeah, and there's like this perennial secret religion, and all of those other religions are like just kind of the manifestation of that universal spirit that drives all mankind. And the nice thing about that, if you're a perennialist, is that you don't have to listen to the daggone priests, because obviously the priests aren't tuned into the perennial, spirit of
Okay.
wisdom moving mankind.
Yeah, no,
So that's my personal little critique of perennialism.
It's
I've heard
absolutely
of-
right. I agree.
I heard Hegel talked about like spirit, but I don't think he talked about like all things coming the same.
Yeah. Well, that's an outsider's look on perennialism. And if you want to learn about perennialism, maybe you should practice my rule and listen to it from somebody who loves it.
Yeah.
But it just seems to be a little bit convenient that you get to be in charge. You don't have to submit yourself to a tradition that's bigger than you, because you can just be like, oh, well, I actually have insight into the religion behind all of these other religions, and I know this
Well-
particular priest is incorrect about this, so I can phase in with the higher religion.
I mean, Father Eric, I think it's beyond the obvious problems with it theologically. It's just way too speculative, given how separate things geographically. There might be something we said that different religions were ways that people related themselves to the infinite or related themselves to the eternal, but that's not the same thing as, oh, there's one secret religion that we can somehow know what's behind it. It's unsupported and
So you think I'm being a little unfair to the perennialists?
no, I don't think you're being unfair at all. I'm just saying we have to understand the context. What do you mean by all religions are getting at the same thing? If you're saying most of them are trying to get at similar ethical concepts, perhaps, although I would disagree with that because there are obviously very different ethical conceptions throughout all the religions. But if you're saying that there was one religion which all the later ones are derived
Well, I'm
from,
not a perennialist.
no.
I'm not a perennialist.
I'm just
To
saying
be clear, yeah.
to distinguish between how, because some people might just have very confused conceptual thinking.
Yeah. How did we get here? Oh, yeah, King Charles. King Charles. What were we
Well,
talking about before King Charles?
Dominicans.
Dominicans. Yeah, Dominicans good.
but
Henry
what
VIII bad.
bad, yeah. What I like about is the Catholic convert G.K. Chesterton. Um, you know about, I'm sure all of you know about G.K. Chesterton. One of the things he said was about the Catholic Church. He says he was an art, a really good Catholic. He said we belong to a church or a Catholic church not founded on not founded to move with the world, but the Catholic Church rather is founded to move the world. In other words, as I sort of, I think he captures that current feeling that the church, unfortunately, has been attacked. I'm talking about the Catholic Church from all sides, and it's being castigated, and it's sort of being on the defensive. And Catholicism, there is a concept called the just war. In other words, even killing someone else if they attack you, it's justifiable. And it used to be more masculine church. I'm talking about Middle Ages and so forth. But talking about uh, scholasticism and the so-called Dark Ages, in fact, there is a very interesting book which describes the Dark Ages as stable ages. What he meant by that is, if you can imagine Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, just before the Crusades, you were born in a village. 98% of people were born in a village, and they intermarried with various other villages, and the center was the church. The church was the hospital. The church was the pharmacy. And if you travel on a pilgrimage, you stayed over and slept in the next suburb or whatever. So it was everything. It was the social security. There weren't any pensions, and usually people had a lot of children, and you've usually one of the sons has usually enters the church, becomes a priest, and so forth. And talking about uh, the, the, the progress of the Catholic Church, it's interesting as sort of a side issue. The oldest operating, which I had the pleasure, the oldest operating pharmacy is in Croatia, Dubrovnik, founded in 11th century by I don't know which order. I think it's Dominicans or one of those orders, and it still operates a pharmacy. So it's very interesting. I was there, and it's one of those things which is sort of, you look at the history and everything. It's just mind boggles. You look at it and you say,
I mean,
wow.
to my understanding, the Catholic Church does have a doctrine that non-Catholics can still go to heaven, or it won't be banished from God if they're
Oh,
otherwise good people.
it's a possibility.
Possibility.
It's a possibility. It's not necessarily excluded. The main trouble is that the wheres and the hows and the whos is entirely up to God. So
I understand
you
it's
can
up to
say,
God, but I'm saying in principle, anybody, even atheists, but certainly religious Jews, Protestants, other religions, and even atheists could, in principle, if they're good people, go to heaven. Or
it's not about them just
Mm.
being good people, right? So that's you're getting into kind of Pelagian territory there, whereby by our good works we merit salvation. Now, I certainly don't want to
Mm.
discourage anybody from good works, but we'll say that the salvation is a free gift of God. And so that's why it's okay. Who is God extending this gift to? outside of the visible bonds of the church and the sacramental system. And it's kind of like, well, actually, that's up to him, And, I was talking to somebody recently, and they noted this particularly American tendency to have this idea that people have a fundamental right to, the context was heaven, but we'll say, salvation, grace, and all those sorts of things. And that actually kind of misses the point, is that this is actually a grace, a gift, a free and unmerited um, choice that God makes for us, rather than, something that you have a right to and you could only lose by bad behavior. So that's the way to think about it. Is God's certainly free to call whomever He chooses, and and you could even think it's probable that He does, and that makes sense to me. That's kind of my position. It's like, yeah, He probably didn't condemn every single Native American prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus and preaching of the gospel. Like every single one of them to perdition. It doesn't seem likely to me, but ultimately, it's not my choice. It's one of these things that we leave up in God's hands, and we just let Him worry about it.
Has the Catholic Church always had this view?
That's probably the one I just articulated is a little bit more of a modern attitude. You read, especially the missionaries who came over here and began preaching the gospel. Your Saint Junipero Serra, your Saint Isaac Jogues, and the Franciscan and Jesuit missionaries that did a lot of work here. They were a little more medieval in their conception, and they probably wouldn't have acknowledged what I just said, except as a remote possibility. So
there's always been a view that it's possible for non-Catholics to go to heaven, but it's never been emphasized as much as it is in the modern day.
that's probably fair. I don't know. I'm not sure if these were questions that people in the early church worried about the way that they worried about it in the Middle Ages. So I'm not sure if there was even like a cohesive attitude in the first 1,000 years of Christianity about those questions. Yeah.
Was Jordan Peterson baptized Catholic?
No, I think he was Church of Canada, like a Anglican Canadian branch of the Anglican Church.
So can I ask, what's so special about Jordan Peterson?
It's just
Nothing
really
particularly
interesting that
special.
people are paying attention to him. Right? It's more, and the people who pay attention to him a lot of them are, certainly were, right? 2017, 2018, kind of secular types, maybe were not raised with any faith at all, maybe raised in church and decided to give it up as college students or teenagers or whatever. And they started listening to Dr. Peterson and then started taking the Bible seriously. They started listening to Dr. Peterson. A lot of them, people that Kirk and I might know, decided to start going to church after listening to Dr. Peterson. So I found certain of his, teachings to be useful. His stuff on the Big Five's really useful. His stuff on perception and teleology, I think, is quite interesting. His interpretation of the Bible is curious. I'm not really sure that the best way to understand Abraham is as a call to adventure Jungian hero. Like I'm kind of like, I think you're kind of stretching there. He's kind of trying to fit Abraham into his box, but he can still get some useful insights out of that, at least the moral sense of Scripture, that sort of thing. So it's more like Dr. Peterson's got some interesting stuff, but look at the people who are listening to him. That's really interesting, and what's going on there, because he seems to be I can't remember who
Well,
said
is
this,
Jordan
but it's
Peterson
really good.
the main thing is, do you believe Jordan Peterson actually is convinced of most Christian doctrine? Because this has been the main debate in that Christian world, is that you have this professor talking about the Bible, talking about God, talking about Abraham, but he's never very direct about what he's convinced is true or likely true about the historicity, about Revelation, about these types of things. And so, like,
Yeah,
would
yeah.
you say Peterson is in the Christian, you'll say, Christendom as a political unit?
No, I mean Christendom as a political unit's done, so don't worry about that. I'd say Peterson is an extremely consistent Darwinian thinker, right? And when you actually take the principles of Darwin seriously, right, he got to the bottom of that and he decided, oh, I got to start taking traditional religion seriously because he's a Darwinian thinker. And he notices all these political parties, all of these countries, all of these nations, all of these ethnic groups, these things come and go. But these religious patterns that people engage in of worship and ritual, those are really old. Those have lasted. And so if Darwin has taught us anything, it's like that's something that you need to hold on to because that works. That's fitted to the environment there. I remember I listened to him. He came to Fargo, right? And I went with my sister and brother in law to listen to his lecture just because it was like, I should just go check it out, you know. I had nothing else going on that evening. And he he was talking about this idea that if you could study a animal properly, you should be able to deduce the kind of environment that it lives in. And I thought he was going to go in a real theological direction with that. And then he didn't. He just started talking about Noah. He went to more familiar territory. So anyway, basically, I think he got to the bottom of Darwinism and decided that traditional religion was something he needed to start taking seriously because that's what had lasted.
But by taking seriously, do you believe that it's just he believes it's good as a ethical force or as a political force, or do you believe he's actually convinced of the propositions that Christianity relies on?
Yeah, he seems to waffle on that, doesn't he?
Well, what do you think he's at currently?
I think he's undecided.
You just think he's undecided? I mean, that's
That's
fair enough.
actually, I mean, so I'm trying to read his mind, and I haven't listened to the latest conversation with Dawkins and O'Connor, and I probably won't. Um, I think, he's getting to the very like this is something that Peterson will do, and he does it a lot. He's very careful, right? Like he really takes his own rules seriously, except when he's on Twitter. But never mind that. When he's speaking to another human being rather than to a screen, he's very careful. He'll get up right to the edge of materialism, right? And like right to the edge of where his Jungian Darwinian analysis can take him. And he'll peek over the edge and he'll say, gosh, there's got to be something really interesting out there, but I don't know what it is. And he's unwilling to bridge the gap from materialism into considering faith, grace, spirits, all of that. Um, because he hasn't figured it out yet. And I don't think he can figure it out unless he goes through a paradigm shift where it gets to the point where he realizes that some of the things that he believes in are actually articles of faith, um, like the Darwinian principles that he operates on, and wanting to be allied with goodness rather than not goodness. Those are articles of faith for him. Uh, and maybe he's just unwilling to add an additional article of faith, like in the resurrection of Christ. So that's just what I think, though.
Yeah. I mean, in general, I do think you're going to see amongst young people more of a resurgence amongst religion. I don't. I mean, I don't know, but I feel because of how likely what we see politically going on with Trump and his popularity, you are generally going to see a religious revival. But how that plays out in terms of specific doctrines versus practices versus rituals. I don't know. I just have an intuition from what I see politically and culturally that you are going to see less a sort of a desecularization period coming soon. I mean, I might be wrong.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's you're not the first person I've heard say that. And I think it was Pastor Paul Vanderklay who was talking about like the tide waves of new atheism were starting to recede, and that is really interesting, right? Because we think that things all happen at once, but they definitely don't. Because new atheism, right? Dawkins, Hitchens, all of that business. Um, that was basically just 19th century British materialism and skepticism. And in the 19th century, that was mostly reserved to like, the educated classes. And it's like the wave was breaking and then it kind of went mainstream for a little bit. You'd have, we'll say rather working class people, rather uneducated people doing this. And then by the time it like breaks there, it starts to recede pretty quickly because that's kind of its high point, and something's going to come after that because it's just weak and false. You can't build a civilization on that.
Yeah.
So it looks like it's at its strongest and it's taking up the most territory. And it's exactly that moment that it begins to fail.
Yeah, I mean, and so in terms of modern Catholic media, would you say you're a fan of Bishop Robert Barron?
Yep, yep. I think, if I got to have a fraternal conversation with him, we might have some very interesting conversations. There might be some certain issues that I would push him on, but I think he is generally a very good spokesman for Catholicism. Um, I think he was devastating against the new atheists, and that's what kind of brought him into prominence, right? Because he was basically able to, I mean, some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier, right? God's freedom and man's freedom. He was basically able to point out that the atheists that the Dawkins and such were the God that they were criticizing and saying wasn't existing wasn't actually the doctrine of the Christians. If you're going to understand them in the way the church is always, or at least consistently understood.
Speaking about clergy, what do you think of Father James Martin, your fellow American Jesuit?
Yeah, yeah. Well, he can be pretty Jesuitical sometimes.
What about Vigano?
I think Vigano is. I mean, it's kind of a sad case because you read the profiles of him. He was always a very earnest and sincere fellow, and he kind of wore his heart on his sleeve. And yeah, I don't follow him. I don't think a lot of his interventions post 2018 have been very helpful. And,
what about Archbishop Schneider?
I liked his book. Yeah, I've read a few of his books. He seems to be a pretty solid
Who's
guy.
Archbishop Schneider?
He is an auxiliary bishop in Kazakhstan, a great promoter of the traditional Latin Mass, and a solid intellectual. He's a refugee from the Soviet Union. His
That's
parents
right,
were able to flee from. I can't remember what country he came from inside the Soviet Union, but they were in Germany, and then he became a Catholic there, or he was Catholic, and he was raised there, became a priest there, and very well educated. And I think he speaks quite cogently about tradition and all those sorts of things. So,
what about Williamson?
The SSPX guy?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I heard rumors about him having a portrait of Adolf Hitler in his office, and
Really?
I'd heard that rumor, right?
Right.
And And I think, didn't he get kicked out of the SSPX for being too extreme?
I'm not quite sure on
What's the
that. Yeah,
SSPX?
All right, here we go. We've got time for one more history lesson, and then I'm going to bed. All right.
All right. What's the time there, by the way? Which part of
It's
America?
9:20 p.m.
In what city of America?
Fargo, Central Time.
All right.
And if you're in Mississippi, Kirk, you'd be on Central Time too, right?
Yeah, it's 9:20 for me as well.
Yeah. So we've got the big liturgical reforms in 1970. The new edition of the Roman Missals published. Archbishop Lefebvre, originally a Frenchman, but he was the head of the Holy Ghost Fathers. That was a big missionary order. A lot of activity in Africa and Asia. He objected to the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council. And you got to remember, he is a missionary. So he isn't really a university educated kind of fellow. He is a practical, let's get her done kind of fellow. So his main objection to the new Mass was the old Mass works better. So he founds his own Society of St. Pius X, and he trains his seminarians and the priests that he has, gathered around him to do things the old way, that they weren't going along with the revised Roman Missal there. And he, throughout the 1970s, constant head butting with Rome. Rome's trying to get him to go in line. But he's drawing a lot of people and clerics, seminarians to himself, who are dissatisfied with the change in the liturgy. Starts progressing through the 1980s. Archbishop Lefebvre is getting older and older, and he begins to worry that there isn't going to be a bishop who's going to be willing to ordain his seminarians using the old rites. And so he starts asking for permission to ordain some more bishops for his society. There's a lot of controversy as to whether or not Vatican said yes, Vatican said no, or Vatican says no, but later yes. All these sorts of things that I don't want to get into. But the indisputed fact is that I think it was June of 1988, Archbishop Lefebvre went forward with consecrating 4 men to the episcopacy who, without a papal mandate. And doing that is a automatic excommunication for both the bishop doing that and those who received it. So the leadership of the SSPX was excommunicated at that time. So that's the SSPX right now. In every place that they operate without the permission of the local bishop. There hasn't been a single mission to open a chapel within their territory. So that's a big problem for me because I've got a lot of very nuanced opinions about Vatican II, but one of the things I am a really big fan of is its kind of counterbalancing with Vatican I in burnishing the role of the local bishop as a proper shepherd of his diocese. And it's like the principle of subsidiarity and action, that the bishop needs to have authority ordinary and proper to himself, rather than just being considered a branch manager of Catholic Incorporated. So on the one hand, we've got an act of disobedience. On the other hand, I'm like a fan of the traditional Latin Mass, and if he hadn't gone against Vatican wishes, I don't think we would be celebrating it at all today. Like, it might have entirely been snuffed out. I'm not sure, because there was a group of priests from the SSPX that broke off when the illicit consecrations happened and formed the priestly fraternity of St. Peter. And they went to Rome and were like, hey, we don't want to go along with Lefebvre. Can you give us a mandate to to hold on to these traditional Latin Mass. They got permission from Rome. They've got kind of the hierarchical communion with the Holy Father, and their mission has been, as far as I can tell, fairly successful. Um, I'm sure
And who
some of the
was this guy
places
who
Jim.
said was excommunicated because he had a picture of Hitler or something like that?
Well, and then this is just a rumor. I've not gotten good sources on it, but one of the four bishops that Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated was Bishop Williamson. Allegedly had a portrait of Adolf Hitler in his office, and allegedly, and I don't know the insides of this, so you're gonna have to talk to somebody else on it. Allegedly, he got kicked out of SSPX for being too extreme. That's just what I had heard somewhere. I haven't really gotten to the bottom of this.
He was a former Anglican converted to Catholicism.
Yeah. So SSPX is it's a real interesting history there. Sure would like to see them brought back into the fold.
What worries me, if I can sort of, just looking at the world today, it's the silence of the Catholic Church, of our shepherds, namely bishops, cardinals, archbishops, on current events in the world, and in law, in law, silence can mean that you consent to what's going on, and particularly Gaza and the Western world, including Australia. Again, this is politics. This is not philosophy or theology. It's shameful. As I said before, the church should stand for something, especially the Catholic Church, not go with the flow in terms of money, politics,
And what do you
comfort.
believe the Catholic Church's position should be on Gaza?
Well, now we're politicizing. Well, if any human being, if you value and treasure human being, whether they're Catholic or whatever creed, race, ethnicity, etc., should not be massively exterminated. That's
There's
all
always
I've got to
lots
say.
to pray for. There's always lots to pray for.
For example, I can, Kirk, I don't know what
Jim?
you said.
Mr. Jim, I think I'm wrapping it up. All right.
All right, no
I
worries.
think
Thank
you
you.
should
it's
talk
just-
to Jacob about this. I think you should talk to Jacob about this, but that's a different
Yeah.
conversation.
That'll be for another live stream.
Thank you. Thank you for
Gentlemen.
having me.
Yeah,
Good night,
gentlemen.
you.
Good night. Good night. It's dark and rational creatures go to bed, so I say good night and God bless you all.
No, it's 1:30 in the afternoon here, so there you are.